This is the WM Review podcast, wmreview.org. If you like it, then please like it, share it, and all those other things that need to be done. This is a podcast entitled On the Immorality of Labelling Other Catholics as Radical Traditionalists. So, in order to address this topic, we have to remember whose heirs the modern-day traditionalists really are. We are the heirs of the generation that lived through and after Vatican II. Let's recall the absolutely certain facts, shorn of all interpretation or explanation. This is what we should all be able to agree on, whether we think it's good or bad or whatever. Here we go. The period following Vatican II was marked by massive apostasy from the Church, a collapse in vocations and the defection of very many priests, nuns and religious, an almost total breakdown of the passing on of the faith and the enforcement on the part of the hierarchy, and extensive changes in the week-to-week, day-to-day experience of practising Catholics across the entirety of the Latin Rite of the Western Church. It's obvious that many of a younger generation today do not really understand the devastation of that period. But these are the facts. One can explain them or justify these facts as one wishes, and one can even say these changes were good, but these facts are not open to dispute. In the face of all this, when you were in the moment of those changes, what were Catholics supposed to do? So we'll talk about the duties of Catholics. In one of his epistles, St. Paul tells us to stand fast and hold the traditions which we have learned, whether by word or by our epistle. And that's from 2 Thessalonians 2:14. This is our first duty, this standing fast and holding to tradition. That's the first duty when confronted with something or with anything that contradicts or requires us to abandon what we have received. To stand fast and hold to tradition. It's our first duty because it's the clearest duty. We know what we've received is good and true. But the situation can't be resolved with simplistic claims that the changes came from authority and therefore we should accept them. As we all know, St. Paul also tells us the following: though we, or an angel from heaven, preach a gospel to you besides that which we have preached to you, let him be anathema. As we said before, so now I say again, if anyone preach to you a gospel besides that which you have received, let him be anathema. That's Galatians 1, verse 8 to 9. With all this in mind, I want anyone listening, especially younger listeners, to imagine themselves in the position of someone who converted to the Catholic faith from Protestantism or from whatever before Vatican II. At that time, to become a Catholic from some other sect, you had to take a profession of faith, the Tridentine profession of faith. It was a little bit more involved than what you would have if you were going through RCIA today. In this profession of faith, you have to solemnly profess loyalty to, quote, the ecclesiastical traditions. So that's what they call small t traditions, and to the, quote, accepted and approved rites, end quote. That's the text in the profession of faith. You do that in the sanctuary. I know perhaps today people are very desensitized to laymen being in the sanctuary behind the altar rails. There are no altar rails. But it'd be one of those rare occasions where a layman would be allowed into the sanctuary and he would have his hand on the Gospels, the book of the Gospels, and would solemnly profess loyalty to the things I just mentioned and profess the Catholic faith there. In many cases, especially in England and elsewhere, this profession was made with great social and familial costs that accompany conversion to the Catholic faith. The same is going to be true today in certain countries where Christianity is illegal, for example. Just imagine yourself entering this most holy place where you never otherwise enter and taking this solemn profession of faith with your hands on the Gospels. You could also imagine yourself in the position of a bishop or a priest who's professed that same profession of faith, that same loyalty, perhaps multiple times for each new office. Given all this, it should not be surprising at all that many Catholics were suspicious of or even rejected outright the changes of the 1960s and 1970s. The shocking collapse of faith and practice, which I mentioned, which accompanied those changes, simply confirms this course of action. When confronted with a radical departure from the ecclesiastical traditions and the traditional rites, and in the face of warnings from the hierarchy about the dangers of such departures, can such persons or their heirs be blamed for holding themselves to be bound by their solemn professions and by these magisterial warnings? Should they be blamed because they stood fast and held to the traditions which they had received? To use a modern terminology, this would be blaming the victims, and it's far too simplistic. And yet, very sadly, conservative apologists, and many of whom are quite recent converts and as such should be exercising a lot more caution both in speaking publicly and in condemning others for supposed insufficient Catholicity, these conservative apologists call those who stood fast and we their heirs radical traditionalists. That's why we're called radical traditionalists, for that standing firm. In doing this, these conservative apologists are taking the side of those who are responsible for all this destruction, all this apostasy, and all this chaos. Let's see why. The word radical is a word which is too political and imprecise to mean much more than an insult. It's normally used by those who wish to establish their own views as normative and themselves as reasonable moderates. Naturally, it's also used to designate various groups as other and as vaguely disreputable. But this word radical can help us, and those who use it to otherize their opponents, to understand the present ecclesiastical landscape. Some have tried over the years to reclaim the word radical as a badge of honour, but in fact the word typically denotes a favouring of fundamental change and has strong associations with revolution and revolutionary politics. Nothing could be less appropriate in reference to traditional Catholics. There's nothing revolutionary about traditional Catholicism. It's all about, as I've said, standing fast, holding firm to tradition, and just saying no to change. Along these lines, we can see that those who try to shore up a conservative settlement of the Vatican II changes are playing a role that's recurred in various major revolutions throughout history. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? After the initial period of frenzy, be it of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or the English Reformation, a more moderate faction emerges and seeks to restore some level of equilibrium. In some cases, as with Kerensky or the Girondins, these moderate factions fail and are swept away. And in others, as with Napoleon or the Anglican Elizabethan settlement, they succeed, at least for a time. There may have been many noble and admirable men in these moderate factions, including the moderate conciliar conservative faction today. But each of these factions remained the products of the revolution in which they were born. They continued to accept the revolution's year zero, and they continued to be imbued with its ideals, presuppositions, and agendas. This alignment is all the more clear for their condemnations of those who predated their revolution and took no part in it at all. One thing's certain, no matter how good their intentions, under no circumstances can these moderate factions be considered as the legitimate heirs of the older orders, any more than the Elizabethan settlement represents the continuation of the Catholic Church in England. They are the heirs of a radical rupture with each older order, and they seek to moderate their given revolutions only to the degree that their own private judgment dictates, or to the degree that is necessary to stabilise the so-called advances made. As far as the various ancient regimes would be concerned, these moderate factions are just as radical as their more obviously destructive colleagues. In short, the term, along with the terms defined in opposition to it, such as the odious term gladtrad, is little more than virtue signalling. showing that the user is not like those whom he wishes to condemn. How ironic that this is often done under the guise of being charitable. In fact, it recalls the words of the Pharisee in the parable, "O God, I give thee thanks that I am not as the rest of men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, as also is this publican," from Luke 18:11. Regardless of the intention, the word does not apply to traditional Catholics. If this regrettable and largely meaningless word radical is to be applied to anyone, and it would be better if we refrained from such wanton, inflammatory language, then it should not be to those who stood still and simply continued to practice the Catholic religion. Rather, it should be applied to these would-be moderates themselves, who are the heirs and the defenders of the conciliar revolution itself. Everybody thinks that his own position is moderate and is the mean between two extremes. But we are always someone else's radical. We're always too much for someone else's standards. Positioning ourselves as moderates or centrists is a fool's endeavour. Nobody, least of all those attacking Catholic tradition, is convinced by this tired rhetorical move. One of the key reasons that revolutionaries have made so many inroads over the last century is that they avoid such virtue signalling and avoid criticising or condemning their fellow travellers. In general, they stay silent when their more radical colleagues push forward ahead. After all, as they say, there are no enemies on the left. The same cannot be said for those who seek to defend the Catholic Church in this day, many of whom spend time criticising those who they consider to have gone too far. Everyone wants to be as simple as doves, but few want to be as wise as serpents. As the Lord said, "For the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light." Analysing this phenomenon, the Gordon brothers wrote the following, quote, "This sort of opportunistic virtue signalling is to be avoided at all costs. It's as if naive modcons think that they will earn the respect of radicals, the revolutionaries, by appearing sufficiently just to mete out chastisement to members of their own tribe. Don't fall into this trap. Radicals will not hold the traitorous modcon in higher regard than the rest of his ilk. Instead, they'll happily accept the services of the useful idiot and then discard him when he has naught left to offer." End quote. This is especially so in terms of language, including calling traditionalists radical. As the Gordons write elsewhere, language matters a lot, and radicals, namely in the revolutionary sense, are highly cognizant of this. If we continue to cede control of the English language to scoldy, imperious SJWs, then we might as well just officially surrender Western society to them as a fait accompli. Stand your ground. Use the words that most faithfully describe a concept, not the unwieldy, hyphenated euphemism that the radical would prefer because it tends to paint his agenda in a positive light. Conserve the rules of our language and don't capitulate when radicals attempt to change them to conform to the asinine presumptions of critical theory. Language is a tool for communicating truth. If language is manipulated, then the truth is manipulated. Even if the so-called moderate influencers believe that some aspects of the traditionalist critique goes too far, they should nonetheless recognise reality. Both they and the traditional Catholics whom they attack have often been defending the very same doctrinal points against the same set of attacks. Although the plethora of would-be influencers use this term radical traditionalist as a stick with which to beat their online rivals and their followers, it's clear that the insult passes through such persons and on to those who actually suffered for the Catholic religion under the conciliar revolution and did so for decades. These moderate influencers wish to defend Vatican II and the conciliar popes, but there's no doubt that the traditional Catholics whom they condemn, particularly the older generation, many of whom are still alive today, have been the confessors of the faith in a ghastly period of apostasy and tyrannical misrule. You can say what you like about us, but abusing them is a strikingly unjust way to behave towards those who've lovingly suffered for Christ and his church in a myriad of ways. A little bit of historical and situational awareness, humility, respect, and basic human kindness would go a long way for these influences' credibility. Finally, the use of the term radical is not only meaningless, but also dangerous. It's become clear that it's used by political and governmental forces who are arguing for the necessity of infiltration and surveillance of perfectly law-abiding, kind and decent people. And what should we say of those who are themselves traditional Catholics, but try to put this term radical onto their co-religionists, almost as an attempt to ingratiate themselves with the various surveillance agencies and left-wing organisations at the expense of others? There are no words for such conduct, but we can state the general points in even clearer terms. If there was ever any doubt, following the various FBI leaks in 2023, we should not hesitate to say that the use of the term radical traditionalist by any Catholic is contrary to the 8th commandment, unjust and immoral. Those who use this term to further their online apostolates and to stir up controversy are bad people. They should be treated as having no moral credibility whatsoever. Going forward, anyone who uses this term or its analogues in good faith should be directed to this essay or this podcast, which we hope will set them aside from this disreputable conduct. Thanks for listening. This was the WM Review podcast. Head over to wmreview.org, and if you like this video, you know what you have to do. Thanks very much.